Okay, over to you.
You breaking up, Dr. Mike.
Yes, Mike, I think your connection is a bit unstable at the moment.
Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you clearly,
Connection is a
Veronica.
bit unstable. Actually, I think he froze.
Yeah.
But I think I can pick up. I think I understand what he was asking. I think he was asking about human rights in Latin America. Very happy indeed to be able to have this session with you today. Really, really happy. I think it was years ago that I had the chance to teach in the Asia Pacific Masters, but it was when it was based in Sydney. And I've never had the chance before to have a session where I've met many cohorts of your masters with you directly. So it's a great privilege for me, and I'm very, very happy to do it. So that's number one. But then going into our topic, I think it's very difficult to assess human rights in Latin America without having a look at the history. You know, human rights is connected to international law, profoundly connected to international law, and law is mostly a tool, and it's a tool that is fashioned in light of history and what happens in society. So it's very difficult to understand the state of affairs of human rights in Latin America, first agreeing on which parameters we're going to use, but then also understanding the base issues, problems that we face in the region. And I think that we have to start with the historical fact of the Americas pre-existing with its indigenous populations, kingdoms, isolated populations, urban centers, etc., that had this encounter with a different civilization in the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century. And this is the defining moment in the history of the continent when everything changed. And although the continent as it is now is the outcome of that meeting, it is clear that it was a very negative event in the evolution of the populations that lived there originally. It brought a conflict with especially possession of land, that problems that we still have today. You know, the encounter with the European conquerors and then colonizers brought the issue of ownership of land, dispossession of indigenous populations, to the point of genocide in many cases. You know, first wave of this invasion, let's call it, during the 15th and 16th century, while the discovery, you know, as we used to present it in history, started in what we know today as the Caribbean, and then expanded south and north, and that took a number of years. And it defined the relationship with the indigenous populations, the economies, and the politics of those regions. It also gave an homogeneity to Latin America that few regions of the world have. If you separate the former colonies of the US and France, although there was a melange in Canada and what is today the United States, there were different empires, you know. Actually, the United States was originally controlled in a big proportion by Spain. But, you know, if you remove that, then the rest of us from Mesoamerica to the south, it's one language, one religion, with the exception of Brazil, Guyana, and the Caribbean. So this homogeneity that you see Spanish is, after Chinese, the second most spoken language in the world. In terms of number of countries, 35 countries, and also in terms of millions of people that speak it. And also gave this homogeneity in terms of faith. But then it would become more diverse with different waves of immigration later. But it gave this homogeneity, this very particular feature, if you compare it with other regions of the world. So there's been events, processes that have affected the majority of countries of Latin America more or less at the same time. And that included the moment in which, centuries later, the criollos, or the Europeans that had been born in the Americas, decided to push for an independence movement. Obviously, the history books tell us, correctly, that the very first state to do that was what we know today as the United States by the end of the 18th century. But also, then it moved to the rest of the continent. It started, curiously, in Haiti. Haiti, that it's in an island, it's a shared island with the Dominican Republic, 2 countries in one island, and Haiti was predominantly used to extract sugar. They had sugarcane plantations with slaves brought from Africa, and that's the example, or it is the only successful slave revolt in the history of humanity, experts say, and that culminated with an independence movement, independence of Haiti, 1805. The other feature is the introduction of slave trade and, people from other continents into the Americas that took place as from the end of the 17th century, during the 18th century, and then at the beginning of the 19th century, with the independence movements, it was abolished in the Americas. But it provided an additional feature, social feature, the presence, the inclusion of Afro-descendants also. So the societies are mestizas. You would have the indigenous populations, the surviving indigenous populations, very dwindled numbers in some places. Like my country, I'm from Argentina, the indigenous population is reduced, very, very reduced. You have other countries that are, the majority of the population is indigenous origin. But then you have also a big, big, big component of mestizo population that is mixed, European, Afro-descendant, and indigenous. And then you have also societies where there is a big concentration of descendants of European migrants. It's the case of my country, Argentina. So this is important. I'm retelling of this archaeology, let's say, because it's very important to understand which are the problems that we face. Despite the independence movements of the 19th century, despite all the efforts to adopt constitutions that had a Bill of Rights, as it was the case during the 19th century, especially the mid-19th century, 2 things happened. One was a number of civil wars after the Independence War, and usually it was a discussion about the constitutions. What was it going to be? Was it going to be a republic? Was it going to be a constitutional monarchy? Impossible, because we didn't have monarchs in the Americas, but people thought, how to rethink government after leaving colonial empire behind. And that sparkled a big debate. What is going to be a federal state, a unitary state? All this debate about constitutions in many states led to civil war. And then in the 1850s, another effort to regain control over the territory. You can see that in the US and also in my country, in Argentina, where there was another genocide. You know, there were remaining indigenous populations that were massacred or removed or forcibly displaced to make room for a new wave of European migration. And that happened mostly as from 1880 up until, I would say, the 1950s, you know, after the Second World War. So you have first this push to control the land that was still in possession of indigenous populations, that was in Patagonia, mostly the Midwest. It was a military operation. And then there was land distribution. And land distribution is one of the, in the US, there was a push for small parcels of land to be distributed to migrants, to European migrants. But in the case of Argentina, of Latin America, in some cases, there was distribution of small parcels of land, but in many cases, many vast extensions of land were in the hands of very, very few people. And that's at the root of inequality in our continent. You know, all of these elements are at the root of inequality in our continent. You know, possession of land. It's a continent where, with the exception of North America, the rest, they really depends on natural resources to keep their economies going. So mostly there is an extractive, or what we call in Latin America, extractivism issue, you know, especially by foreign companies that extract minerals, oil. This aside from all of the other activities, production of agriculture, etc. So this has defined a type of society, a type of economy that has led to serious inequality, very, very serious inequality. So at the root then we have the problem with the historic exclusion of certain groups, in particular indigenous populations, Afro-descendants as well. Then we have this situation of economic exclusion that is very serious. This exclusion brought political reaction, especially during the 20th century. And in the framework of the Cold War and the national security doctrine sponsored, especially particularly by the United States in the region and in other parts of the world, also brought political violence. And during the 1960s and 70s, there was a resistance movement that got a response from the states of the regions with the format of military governments. So countries that had constitutions, and in most of the cases, republican formulas in the constitution, almost all of them ended up having military governments in control in order to fight what was called at the time subversion and communism. That period, it was one of the darkest periods in the history of the continent, led to the commission of mass human rights violations, massive human rights violations, especially extrajudicial executions and forced disappearances in many of the countries of the region. There are also a couple of intractable human rights situations, internal armed conflicts that have been, it's been very complex to resolve those conflicts. I am speaking in particular of Colombia, that is still struggling despite the fact that it had a very well-known peace accord signed a few years ago, but is still struggling with the same basic conflict, and it has a very, very long-standing guerrilla movement, the FARC, and others, the ELN. So there's that situation that in theory is a post internal armed conflict, but in practice, when you see the figures of human rights defenders that are murdered or attacked, and the basic problems of land possession and inequality, it's unclear whether we're in a real path to reparations. There's been a big effort on the part of the Colombian society to work on the issues of memory and truth of what has happened. Colombia has a very sophisticated legal system, so the efforts have been really commendable in that regard. But in practical terms, on the ground, it's very difficult to see signs of change. So you will have that big internal armed conflict that spills over to the neighbors, because you would have, at some points in the armed conflict, you would have massive Colombian refugees in Ecuador, for instance, and a very tense relationship with Venezuela at the moment. But that's a big problem. And then Haiti also. It's been very difficult for Haiti to achieve stability in terms of its democracy, in terms of its economy. So that's been very, very, very difficult. Having said that, having had a look at those basic problems, very difficult to resolve. Since their inception in the 19th century, as young states, Latin American states always had this aspiration to be acknowledged by the international community. So they always, they were at the forefront of pushing for the development of international law and the principle of equality of states. That is one of the foundational elements of the international system as we know it today. In the 19th century, this was very difficult. States still conducted the mutual relations using the threat of the use of force. If there was a disagreement, issues were resolved with conflict. And that was legal, or at least not illegal, under the international law of the time. Latin American states were at the forefront of pushing for a change. We have to see, suddenly you have around 20 new players in international law. They're very modern states. You have to think that in Europe in the 19th century, the big empires are still in a state of dissolution, and it's only by the late 19th century that national states, as we know them today, emerge in Europe. Okay, so and Africa is still in a big proportion a colony. economy of different empires. So this is a moment in which there's a critical mass of young Latin American states, also the United States and states that are trying to push for a new rules in international law. At the time, even if there was an issue with foreign debts and debt collection, states would go and threaten with the use of force. This was very frequent with the United States. That's the method he would use for debt collection. So, there were lots of statements, lots of developments in terms of private international law and public international law. And then I hope we have the chance later in your academic year to talk about the inter-American system in detail, because it's very interesting how these states pushed, together with the US, for the creation of the first international organization in 1889, that now today we know it as the Organization of American States, as a name it adopted later in 1949, but it was actually conceived and created in 1889. So this is an expression also of the intention of the states to change things at the international level, to be recognized as equals of the other states, the rest of the states of the international community. So all of these elements have influenced the point of view of Latin America vis-a-vis international law and human rights. The creation of the germ of the Organization of American States led to the Latin American states to really push for the strengthening and the codification of international law. So more treaties start appearing. Before, international law was mostly based on customary law, on custom and opinio juris, on practice and opinio juris, the conscience that a rule is binding, but not on treaty. There weren't that many multilateral treaties. This is the era, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century is the era of the international multilateral treaty, the codification of international law. And these states are really pushing for it. And this is also, this influence, this impetus is really felt by the end of the Second World War. Of the 50 states that founded the United Nations, 20 were from Latin America. And therefore they had a profound impact on the fashioning of the organization and some basic standards, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Latin American states have been working in their own American Declaration on the Rights of Duties of Man that was adopted just before the Universal Declaration. So they had a big input in the text and the definitions of the Universal Declaration, not without resistance from the US and European states. For instance, there are recent historical studies on the process of adoption of the Declaration. The Declaration is mostly the outcome of a draft that was presented by Chile and Panama. And there was a big push on the part of the Latin American states to include two rights that did not, Europe and the US did not want to include. And those are the right to equality and the right to justice. So, it's an important legacy in legal terms, but it's a heavy load and baggage in terms of history and in terms of conditions for the protection and enjoyment of human rights. So I think that was my answer to Mike's question. And now I can take questions from you.
Yeah. Well, while we're waiting for questions, I mean, if you could just make a brief response to this. I'm not quite sure if my internet's a bit weak tonight, but because we're doing the ICCPR this week. So yep. Putting the ICCPR in context of Latin America in particular, given that Latin America has such a history of dictators and disappearances and torture. Was it ever really taken on that strongly, or how does it compare to the equivalent treaties in the Inter-American Commission?
Well, I think, again, sorry that I am going to history again. There is a very popular book that came a few years ago, 5 years ago. I think it's called The Last Utopia by Samuel Moynes, who's a historian. And I think he makes he made some points I have problems with, but he makes a valid point that the international protection of human rights, despite the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights being adopted in the 1960s, in 1966, was in a dormant state. And the Universal Declaration was there since 1948, and you have these treaties since 1966. The treaties hadn't even entered into force. You know, they entered into force 10 years later. That's the truth. And although there was a human rights subcommission in the context of the assembly, that now all that mechanism as from 2006 was replaced by the Human Rights Council. But despite those elements, those tools being present, they were in a dormant state. What the event that woke up, let's say, the international community to the use of those tools was precisely the reaction to the dictatorships in Latin America. The dictatorship period, the worst part is end of the 1960s, especially during the 1970s. The worst part is really the government of Ronald Reagan in the United States. That's the worst part, is those years. And then for some countries like Guatemala, it lasted until the early 90s. But mostly we're talking the concentration, the big problem is between in the 1970s and part of the 80s, mostly the 80s. And during that period, these dictatorships, this period in Latin American history, led to the international community, grassroots movements, you know, the emergence of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, with a worldview on human rights issues. But besides them and some NGOs in the United States that were also trying to help human rights defenders and political prisoners, led to the emergence of grassroots human rights organizations in Latin America itself. Those movements are with us today. You know, there's a lot of conscience, and there's a lot of activity on the part of civil society in terms of using international mechanisms. But that was motorized for everyone, not only for the issues of Latin America. That's the moment in which the mechanisms of international protection actually wake up. I'm not saying that, some Moynes says that, and I think he's right, you know, looking at the historical data. So it's not only for us, it's for everyone. It's for everyone. It's just that these serious human rights violations are taking place in Latin America that affects thousands of political and social activists, mostly, some of whom are detained, others, because having a person detained, you know, political detainee was considered to be too messy, much of a problem. You would have international community coming in, you know, these new NGOs, several states, you know, lobbying, etc. So it was easier, it was considered an easier solution to make them disappear, you know. So this monstrous ideology, you know, and solutions to the issue of political dissent and freedom of expression really led to putting in practice what was written in international human rights treaties. And that included, on the one hand, the regional system for human rights protections, the American Convention on Human Rights, that entered into force in 1978, and also the covenants that also entered into force in the 70s, and particularly the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, with a false dichotomy that civil and political rights were different, from social, economic, and cultural rights. A debate that took place in the UN in the 1960s, where there was the concept that civil and political rights were really championed by the Western world, and economic and social and cultural rights were championed by socialism, by the Soviet Union, etc., etc. That false distinction between civil and political and social and economic, and that only with the acknowledgement in 1993 with the Vienna Conference that actually human rights are indivisible, that we cannot conceive civil and political rights without economic, social, and cultural rights, and the other way around. I don't know if that answers the question, Mike. I see here on the side that there are
4 questions. So we'll get Kenny to ask his first. You're there, Kenny? Can you ask your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I see you're very well versed in the topic of the politics of the Latin America. I was wondering what their attitude is towards democracy as a whole, because considering how they have their history of colonization and such, I'm wondering if they have a more positive attitude towards it or more negative, considering its connotation with the West and so on. Yeah.
I was asked this question last week at IMA, your sister program in Europe. They asked me whether, how Western was Latin America. I thought it was a very strange question to me. I'm sorry. I felt it was a very strange question. It's not a very strange question coming from you. I thought it was a very strange question coming from Europeans, because the cultural the cultural impronta of Europe on Latin America is undeniable. It's undeniable, and it's the same. You would question it in the same way that you would question it in the US and Canada. It would be exactly the same, because it's exactly the same situation. The difference is with the US and Canada that they speak other languages, and that especially the British Empire had a different way of going about administering its possessions, its overseas possessions. It had a different system of administration. It was a more modern empire, whereas the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire, but in particular the Spanish Empire, that had such a, the moment of the discovery between commas of the American continent was the heyday of the Spanish Empire. It was in the history of the world. That's the moment in which they had the most important armada. They had a problem with the economy at the time. At some point, they had a big explosion of inflation, and they had problems. But it was a moment of big, transcendence for them. It was their moment, and they had a very complex legal system, very ritualistic, very administrative law was really cumbersome and difficult. And they brought all that complexity, that bureaucracy, to their possessions in the Americas. And for the Americas, it was a heavy load to shake after the independence in the 19th century. Very, very difficult. It was the complexity of the systems, the control systems in Seville, Spain, the different viceroys that would be established, how such a big portion of land, how it was divided into different units, then into subunits, then somebody appointed, it was unapplicable. It was very difficult to apply. So from the very beginnings, Latin America had a very difficult relationship with law and authority. From the very beginning, the agility that the British Empire had in connection with how it administered its possessions. I'm not saying that it was good or bad. I'm just saying that it was more agile, okay? Whereas this, 15th, 16th century power, the Spanish Empire, had a very bureaucratic way of going about it, to the point that it was very difficult to apply rules. There were so many of them, they were so difficult to apply. It's very interesting how here in Argentina, that we are so far away. If you remember the map, we're at the end, of the continent, or at the beginning, because there's no up and down in the universe, but we're really far away from the main, far away from the main ports of main points of discovery and the big cities at the time. The big cities were actually, the first point of entry was what today's Dominican Republic. And then there was a big outpost in Lima, Peru. Okay, that was the richest place, the most important. We were really far away. So it was very difficult for ships to get to Buenos Aires, to the port of Buenos Aires. It was extremely difficult. It took many months, many perils. And also, the British Empire, especially during the 18th century, had a strategy of attacking Spanish vessels because they had gold, all sorts of goods, so there was this piracy situation that was, promoted also from the British Crown. It's all in literature, in history, in the movies. I'm sure you've seen it. So it was very difficult for ships to get there. So in many countries, especially in the southern cone, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, that is a landlocked state, Bolivia, it was very difficult to exercise authority and the rule of law. Extremely difficult. So that we reflect a lot about this and our relationship with authority and the rule of law. But once we managed to get independent, to attain our independence, and that happened gradually. For instance, in Argentina, it happened in 1816, but it was considered a continental victory. When we finished, when we were all done, it was 1820. And famously, there was a movement, one from the south and one from the north. The one from the north towards the south, championed by Bolivar. I'm sure you've heard the name in your history books. And the one from the south to the north by San Martin. That's our national hero, but it's also the national hero of Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. Those were the countries that, in a way, he fought the battles for. And then they became independent in their own right. And then there was this discussion, about what political system. And as I mentioned before, the discussion took 20 more years, 20 more years of civil war in the different countries. So, it was a very meditated decision, which political system we were going to adopt. And most countries went with a hybrid version of US Constitution, the text of US Constitution, but mostly Napoleonic Code. So you have a melange of US, very Anglo-Saxon sort of Bill of Rights and structure of government with presidentialist systems. So you have a strong executive power, like in the United States. That is not a parliamentarian system, it's a presidential system, okay, republic. It has three, it's executive, legislative, and judiciary, but with a very, very strong executive power. But at the same time, in terms of the sort of civil law and the models for the administrative law, is all inspired by France and Portugal and other sources. So you have this melange. Well, on the one hand, you borrow from the US, but then you don't continue borrow from the common law. You don't use the common law system. You use a civil law system, the continental system, the Napoleonic Code. And you go for codification. You don't go for precedent. So it was a challenge, it's still a challenge to make that work. Okay, so there's nothing, it has nothing to do with genes or whatever, or with, conceptions of the world. It's your choice. It has to do with the historical choices. And then there is another element. You're borrowing common law and you're borrowing Napoleonic Code and civil law, and then you try to impose it, on everyone as if everyone was a descendant from a European migrant. And that's not the case. That's more the case in some countries than in others. Maybe in Argentina, Uruguay, more in those countries. But the rest of Latin America is mestizo, it's mixed, which is one of the good things about it. It's one of the good things about it. But that has led us in the last 10 years to reflect a lot on decolonization, on how to shake this idea that the standard is the European standard. Whereas, we also have in some countries, Bolivia, for instance, a few years ago, adopted a new constitution, referring to the notion of plurinationality. So it changed its name to Plurinational State of Bolivia. Why? Because the majority of the population is indigenous. The majority of the population, the phenotype, let's say it, is indigenous. Not everybody acknowledges him or herself as indigenous. In the Americas, we have this other element, who is indigenous and who's not. Whomever recognizes him or herself as indigenous. So you would have people with indigenous phenotype that do not recognize themselves culturally as indigenous. They want the European sort of legal framework. They prefer to abide by that legal framework. Culturally, they feel more attuned to that, and others don't. So, you need to find a space for both. We can't reconvert to an indigenous culture because it's not possible. But we cannot ignore that there are many communities and individuals that are indigenous, that that's the nature of our continent, that's the culture, the regional culture of our continent. So there are lots of, I don't want to call them experiments, but there's now this movement to recognize also the right of certain communities to apply indigenous law to resolve certain types of conflict, resolve them under indigenous law, and recognize indigenous law that also exists and was coexisting with the mandate, the official language with Spanish for everyone. The official language is Spanish for everyone, but there are lots of indigenous languages that are spoken in the continent and that we're trying to preserve. But it's very difficult because they keep on disappearing. So now indigenous languages are acknowledged in the constitutions. You have the Constitution of Guatemala that acknowledges indigenous languages. It's all very well, but aside from acknowledging indigenous languages in the constitution, you need translators when somebody from an indigenous community is accused of committing a crime and doesn't speak Spanish, doesn't speak the language in which the trial is being conducted. So, you know, there's this complexity about it that we're starting to appreciate now. It was always there, but now we're starting to appreciate, it's starting to be appreciated in domestic law as well, because of all the work that has been done on the right to equality since the adoption, the ratification, more like, of the human rights treaties. The human rights treaties were adopted in the 1960s, the big ones. Then, you know, we've continued adopting treaties on specific matters. But, you know, the American Convention on Human Rights, the UN covenants, all adopted in the 1960s. They entered into force in the 1970s. And the big push for the application was this, the pressure that the national security doctrine, sponsored by the US, applied because we were all the victims of the Cold War, etc., brought on civil liberties. And this was a perfect example in which they could be applied. And that also led to invigorating the civil society, you know, in these countries of Latin America and around the world as well. So more or less, this is what I was, I think that's my answer.
Okay. We've only got another 10 minutes and we've still got 3 questions. So okay, maybe we'll just have to give some brief answers, but then we've got Brennan. You've got a question, Brennan?
Hello. I'll keep this question short. I appreciate all the information so far. It's been really interesting. But my question is regards to a current issue, and that is the climate change in South America. I was hoping you could maybe explain a little bit, or maybe make the connection between the migration up to the north and how that's a human rights issue, because I lived in El Paso my last 2 years, and I saw the human rights issue along the border with the government not knowing what to do, and literally just making refugee camps on site. And so I was hoping maybe you could explain a little bit with that climate change.
Okay, I'll try to do quickly. It's difficult, but it's 2 issues there. One thing is migration to the north, and another thing is climate change and the impact of extractive industries and what is going on with the fires also in the Amazon, etc. is 2 very distinct issues. For the first one, my answer is very simple. We're talking about communities, the ones that supposedly are migrating to the north. I mean, this land was theirs. Somebody put a frontier there 200 years ago. You know, to me, it looks really strange. I mean, this is the frontier, that frontier between the US and Mexico is the outcome of a treaty. You know, there was a conflict and a treaty, and that's a 19th century frontier. The people we're talking about, most of those are not children of European migrants. those are indigenous mostly and mestizo. So, you know, it's a very artificial issue, the one of a frontier that has been there for 200 years. When you're talking to populations that have been there, they're indigenous populations of that region. And they tend to move in those lands up and down. Somebody put a frontier there 200 years ago. That's, you know, I know that there's a lot of myopia about how we see things, but if we see them in historical perspective, it's very odd, to be honest with you. Then also, Central America has had a very difficult relationship always with the United States. Central American states achieved their independence a little after South American states. And there was a lot of political, but also military influence, impact in those states during the 19th century and also during the early 20th century. And they've been pawns also, especially during the Cold War, you know. All the military interventions, I mean, there's rivers of ink and forest paper about the involvement of the CIA in the conflicts in El Salvador, Honduras, well, Nicaragua is very well known, you know, the support in the conflict between the Contras and the, so, you know, there's lots written about that. And after all the involvement of the United States in the politics, in the conflicts of these states, it's very complicated then to wash your hands, you know, because that involvement generated very negative dynamics and never led to real development. People really, what they want to do is live in peace, let's say. And there are dynamics of citizen violence and conflict in many of those countries that make the population simply want to find a place where they can live in peace. So it's, I think it's important to see it, to understand it. It's very important to see it in a historical and social context. Then that's one thing. And then, well, protection of the environment is a big problem for us, especially in South America. This is the area of the world with the most fresh water. You know, we have the most fresh water in all of the planet. There are lots of minerals that are coveted at the moment. We have, I mean, it's not only the oil and the precious stones and the silver and the gold that the Spaniards used to, you know, extract in the 16th and 17th, 18th century. No, we're talking about lithium. It's a continent that has lithium. That is an element that goes into our cell phones and many modern technologies. And that's another curse that we have. I mean, having these resources turns into a curse, really, more than a blessing. And the other problem we have is extensive agriculture. And many of these countries, their economies are dependent on certain types of agriculture. The current curse is that nowadays it's not even extensive agriculture to produce foods. Mostly we are producing just one crop, that is what we call soja, and also oil palm, but in case of the soja, that's used to feed the pigs that the Chinese eat. So the only thing we're doing A big proportion is just producing food for the pigs that are eaten in China. So there's a very sad state of affairs. And that is also ruining our arable lands. And that's also the reason why certain countries are burning more space to generate more crops. So it's a very, very, very concerning situation.
Okay, so we have Razi. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm Razi from Sri Lanka. My question is about the most controversial prison in the world, that is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, I think.
Yep.
And it is the most controversial issue, and America is running it. And there was Obama's administration was making some efforts to close it, but Mr. Trump said I think he signed an executive order to keep it open, and also he said he's reconsidering the waterboarding again to the bay. So my question is, what are the initiatives or the efforts being taken to close the Guantanamo Bay in relation to the human rights? Also, I'm wondering whether the United States is using the Latin American land to these sort of human rights violations, not making it in their own land and using the Latin American soil to do these extrajudicial or human rights violations. And what is your comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start by the end, because the first question has a concrete answer. When I was talking about the national security doctrine, I was talking about the 1970s and 80s. It's not a doctrine that we would have today, but we were always worried, and seeing the signs, if in case it's applied again. So we don't have the same sort of interference on the part of the US that we used to have in the 1960s and 70s or before, by the end of the 19th century, in the case of Central America especially, or during the 20th century, we don't. The last interventions were in the 1980s, precisely. There was an intervention in Panama. There was an intervention in the island of Grenada. There was also this. Also there was a military approach to resolving some of the problems that Haiti have. That was also during the early 90s. But that's not an approach that has been used, and it wouldn't be accepted today. Many have argued whether the US is going to do something, in its view, that it should do something about Venezuela, for instance, being discussed, and that would be totally unacceptable. And it hasn't happened, because it's clear that it would be, the reaction would be really negative. So, that was something that was like in the toolbox of the US during the 20th century, but not in the 21st century in terms of military intervention. There are other ways of putting pressure. If you deny support for a loan before the IMF, you say that you're not going to provide aid that you were providing before. There are other ways, not lowering the tariffs on certain exports that countries may have to the US. Those are but those are more, more common, more acceptable than military intervention. So, I think we can discard the issue of the military intervention. But in terms of Guantanamo, number one, it was, I don't think it was only Obama that was trying to close it. George Bush Jr. also was trying to close it by the end of his tenure, because he realized that it was a big mistake. So I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but the idea was to find a place where detainees from different conflicts, Iraq, Iran, etc., could be held without being subject to the domestic law of the United States. You see, where do I put them without bringing them into a jurisdiction where they would have the protections of the law? So if they were brought to the US, they would be subject to the US Constitution. So not in the US. But in which other part of the world could they be isolated from the protections of the law? So they found, let's put them in this military base in an enclave that is controlled by the United States, but it's in the island of Cuba. A rarity, a true rarity. It's a military base of the US in Cuba, of all places. So they were brought there. That was 2003. At the time I was working for the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, so I can tell you very clearly that lots of things were done for them. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights issued precautionary measures and started a dialogue with the United States about removing these persons from the military base and placing them under its own jurisdiction. Bring them to the US, before a judge to see whether they've committed a crime. The US did not want to do it because in many cases, there was no evidence that these people had committed a crime. They had just been picked up. I mean, there was a famous case of someone who was he wasn't even 18. He was about 13 years old. And he was just picked up somewhere in Iraq by US soldiers because he was found throwing stones. He was found throwing stones at a tank or something like that. And they just picked him up and took him to Guantanamo. And then what do you do with that? I mean, it's a minor. There's no way. I mean, he didn't commit any crime. There's no way of proving it anyway. He didn't commit the crime in that jurisdiction. It's an impossible legal problem. You cannot solve it. I mean, it's unsolvable. So the way in which, sorry, Mike, that it takes time, but it's an important issue. The way in which the US felt at the time that it could fix it was by establishing a military commission. So it wanted to establish a special military court to try these detainees. Of course, that was not possible because the establishment of the commission was subject, yes, to US law, because they wanted to use military officers or people, employed by the army to become judges in these military commissions. And the US Supreme Court, sort of declared those laws unconstitutional. I mean, there were 3 times before the US Supreme Court, and all of it, every single time they were declared unconstitutional, it was impossible to establish those commissions. They would even employ people to become judges in those military, because there are special courts. They're not courts established within the legal system. And then people would see the files and refuse to act, So you would have people detained in those places without being able to establish their legal status, because also the US refused to apply the Geneva Conventions to them. So not only they were not subject to US law, not only they were not subject to Cuban law, they were not subject to international law either, in the view of the United States. So they had to generate a separate legal system to try them with these special commissions. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, as the UN also, but the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights was very forceful from the very beginning. I said, look, no, you have to release them or take them to your own jurisdiction. Release them. There's no way out of this because you cannot provide. And on top of that, they were held incommunicado, and for a long time they didn't have access to a lawyer. Eventually, they could have access to a lawyer, but it was obvious that they were in a situation in incommunicado detention and without access to legal advice, in which the basic rights could be violated. So the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights said, look, no, they're in the perfect situation to be subject to inhumane treatment, torture, and even extrajudicial execution. And there's no way to verify that the rights of these individuals are being preserved. So you have to release them. But they didn't know how. What would they do? It was too late, but this was by the end of his second mandate. It was absolutely clear when you talk to people in the Bush administration, they would have released them if they could, but they couldn't find a solution anymore. The solutions were bring them to the United States. Impossible from a political point of view, because these people were there in Guantanamo because they're considered to be dangerous terrorists. And bringing them to the US territory would mean that a judge would have to release them because they hadn't committed any crime. And there was no evidence that they had committed any crime. And there was no way of trying them under domestic law. So they would have had to be released in the US. So that wasn't an option for them. The other option was to return them to the jurisdiction from which they were picked up, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc., etc. In many cases, and this was done and it was disastrous, it was a very bad idea, because now that they had spent years under the custody of the United States, they were considered a liability in the places of the world from which they were picked up. So they were also in danger. Their life was in danger. People that were returned to Iraq or Afghanistan, etc., were murdered afterwards. Okay? And then there was the desperate option, which was convince someone to have them, to receive them, a third state. So they went round in the international community trying to convince states to take them. But it was very difficult. At some point they had 400 people. I mean, how do you convince states of the international community to receive 400 individuals who in theory are dangerous terrorists and they haven't committed a crime in your own jurisdiction? What's your excuse? What do you do with them? So, there were special cases. Spain took a couple. Uruguay took a number of people. But they hadn't committed a crime in Uruguay, so they were not in prison. I mean, there was no way of putting them in prison. And they didn't have a passport, so you couldn't really identify them. But you couldn't deny the right to circulation. So if they wanted to leave the country, you had to, what are you going to do? You had to let them do it, So it was a very strange situation. It extended also through Obama. Obama could not close Guantanamo. He tried. It was the very first executive order he signed, closing Guantanamo. He couldn't do it. And not because he didn't want to close it. He couldn't do it because he could not relocate the detainees. It was impossible. It was very, very difficult. Some countries were given money to receive some of the detainees. So, some of them were distributed around the world like that in exchange for money. But it's a terrible situation. I don't believe anything of, President Trump might say things so that he's going to reuse it. I think that's just talk, he knows that everybody knows in the administration that it's a big mistake to insert more people into that military base because it's an unsolvable problem. You cannot define the legal situation once they're there. Sorry, Mike, it was long, but it's an important issue.
I think we'll have to finish it there because I know we've got, for some of us, some people here, it might be quite late at night. But that was a really good overview. We covered a lot of centuries there and a lot of countries, a lot of issues. And I think it's really some really interesting points that you made there. So thanks a lot for that. And it's good that we get to learn more about Latin America. So everyone, so special thanks to Veronica, and we'll end it there. Well, I can also, if you have questions specifically for her, I can give you her email. Okay, thanks, Veronica.
Thanks to you. It was a pleasure. Great questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, leaving the meeting now. How do we?